Morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Jaipur Bookmark. I was looking at my notebook and I showed it to Naveen. I think this sort of describes everything that all of publishing is about. My diary says we're all mad here, and I think we are mad about words, mad about books, mad about how they will sell, mad about how they will be read, everything. So I have with me 4 very interesting writers. Different forms of storytelling is the topic of the panel, but on my right is Cheran, who is a Tamil-Canadian poet. I'm not going to go into long bios, but I'd love them each to describe themselves and their work. Beside him, there's Paul McVeigh, who writes prize-winning novelist, short story writer, short story festival director, fabulous. Then next to him is Carson. Jan is a novelist and a writer, and I'm very, very obsessed with her postcard project, which is what I'm going to ask her to talk about. Immediately on my right is Sunandini Banerjee, old friend, translator, editor, book designer, responsible for so many beautiful books that make their way around the world. So I thought I would actually ask each person to describe their own work and then follow it up with a question I have specific for each writer. Cheran?
So you want me to introduce my work?
Yes, please.
I am a poet, and I've been writing poetry only in Tamil language, and there have been lots of translations of my poetry available in English and all the other languages. My poetry was born in the heat of the war, and my first collection of poetry was titled The Second Sunrise. The Second Sunrise was basically about the burning of our public library in Jaffna in Sri Lanka. So that was the title of my first collection. So to cut a long story short, I could characterize my entire body of work so far from 1981 until 2009 is what we call, first they will burn books, then they will burn the people. So we could also say from liberticide to genocide. So I have been a witness to the war and what happened during the thing. And I was not voluntarily doing it, bearing witness and writing poetry. So, but that has been one of the major role of me in the past 35 years. And in the process, I have discovered a different way of connecting with the people. Not just simply a written word on the page or a performance word on the stage, but it's a different kind of reading and performing poetry in combination with a couple of other things, so that the written word could reach hundreds and thousands of people. Part of the reason was that I think poetry is very extremely important because there was a lot of censorship. We could not write, we could not report. The newspaper I was working for was bombed, right? In academia, we used to say publish or perish, but in the time we grew up, we say publish and be perished. So because of the censorship, people wouldn't know what exactly going on in the other regions where we were living. So the only way I found out, only way that I've been using is to take kind of reporting through poetry to various parts of the thing in order to counter the existing censorship. So that has been one of the second major aspect of the poetry. And the third aspect is I was kicked out of the country and I was in exile, first in the Netherlands and then in Canada where I am permanently settled. So it's a contribution, someone who's a poet living in exile where I cannot speak for the population I work. So I had to reinvent my role and say, I cannot appropriate their voices, I cannot speak for them, but I can speak next to them in solidarity. That is what I am doing right now. Thank you.
Hello. I want to apologize for being Northern Irish, because sometimes it's not easy to understand what we're saying or what we're thinking or why we do what we do. We're very difficult. So I'm going to try and speak slowly, because we speak very quickly as well, and just so that you have at least a chance to understand the nonsense that comes out of my mouth. I'm a writer who came to writing quite late in life. I studied theatre and worked in the theatre, writing and directing plays, and then I wrote comedy in London for about 8 years, and then I got the opportunity to write a short story for an anthology, and I didn't know how to do that, and I just wrote prose then for the first time in my 30s. I came from a very working class background, where we didn't have books in my house, and my mum was quite suspicious of books. She sort of thought it was kind of close to devil worship or something, and sort of like some of the wizardry, putting words together and casting spells and worlds that didn't exist and things. So we had, I had a fear of words, and of my grammar and my Northern Irish vernacular, translating anywhere else outside of my tiny wee ghetto in Ardoyne in Belfast. And so it wasn't until in my 30s that I tried to write prose, because I thought if I wrote plays, it's dialogue, so no one can tell me it's bad English. And I didn't have to actually write proper sentences. I just had to write what people said. And so it was a real insecurity that came from my very poor education and my working class background, as I said. So when I began to write prose, that was something that was very important to me, that I spoke for my people who perhaps didn't have a great education and came from a tiny place where they used words differently. And I also thought that as working class people were portrayed, it was very caricature-like in books, and certainly in the UK, there are not that many working class authors or books being published by working class authors anyway, and telling their stories. So I really thought that was important, and I wanted to talk about my upbringing in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, because I hadn't read a book that told that story from the voice of a child. And so my novel starts with, I was born the day the Troubles started. So I wanted to say, this person doesn't know anything other than fear. It's that generation that doesn't know what it was like to be normal, to only understand intimidation and fear and terror, and how that shaped a childhood. So that was something I felt very strongly about, and I write short stories, and I've written a novel, and I hope to be able to continue to do that, preferably when I'm not jet lagged, because I tried to write something yesterday and it was rubbish. So hopefully it'll come back when my brain arrives from London Heathrow. I think I'm here, but something else isn't. So I'm waiting for that to happen. All right.
Good morning. I am the other half of the Northern Irish contingent. Paul and I are a bit of a comedy duo this week. My name's Jan, and it's really, really lovely to be here. This is my first time in India, and a little bit overwhelmed, but in a good way. I thought what I would tell you about is a project that I got involved with in 2015. I had that dreaded thing, writer's block. Obviously, no one else here at this festival has ever suffered from writer's block. And because I'm an idiot, instead of coming at it slowly, I set myself the task of writing a short story every day for a year. There are an awful lot of days in the year, folks. By the 15th of January, I had decided this was a really stupid idea. There were still 350 days left. I had promised these stories to friends all around the world, and yes, I do have 365 friends. I am that popular. So I knew I had to follow through. I wrote the stories on the back of postcards, and the only rules that I gave myself were the stories had to be influenced by something that I observed or came across that day, and that they had to fit on the back of a postcard. Let me tell you, if we ever have another First World War and we have to send letters to the front, my handwriting is the tiniest thing you will ever see. I'm going to be really good at that. I started out, I could get 150 words on. By the end of the year, I could get 350 words onto a postcard. The lovely thing about it was it formed these connections with people across the world that I had lost physical connection with. I think we live now in a world where everything's online, it's very temporary. People began to send things back to me. I got art in the post, I got knitting, I got letters, I got a jar of jam, which didn't travel very well. But it was lovely. So I thought the best way to do it, I'm going to read two of them. They only take about 40 seconds to read, if that's okay. The first one was influenced by my friend Steve, who's an older man I work with in Belfast, and it's how he met his wife. When we were 16 years old, they sent us to dance lessons down in the city centre. The girls went into one room, we boys went into another. We learnt how to lead. We learnt how to hold the rhythm like the rhythm was a fine line and on either side of it, a sheer drop. We were taught not to apologise to the girls. If we stood upon their toes, it was because their toes had not stepped backwards or forwards at the correct time. We didn't dance with each other. This would have been ludicrous. Almost grown men sweeping each other around the dance floor by the wrists. We danced in lines instead, tiptoeing round our ghost partners as our arms reached out towards them and our feet played footsie with their absent shoes. When we were accomplished enough to deserve partners, they took us into the room with the girls and put us together in pairs. We didn't speak to these girls. Our feet already knew what to say. We were like a two-part harmony, singing together for the very first time. And then I'll just finish with this one, which when you grow up in Belfast, it's not a great place to grow up. There wasn't a lot going on. And I am still almost daily blown away by just how much the city has changed and how lucky we are that on a Friday night, you have to make choices between all of the things that you want to go to. That's a real luxury. So I wrote this wee poem about this, or short story about this. This morning I read that Kay Ryan poem, the one about the fourth wise man who disliked travel and preferred his own bed to the open road, which made me think of the shepherd who went off for a quick wee at exactly the wrong angelic moment, and all the people who, upon hearing there was only one portion of loaves and fish to split between so many, went home to fix their own sandwiches. And the guests who drank themselves blind beneath the tables long before the water turned winish. And of course the disciples, who were almost always asleep in boat bottoms and gardens and other comfortable spots, missing the point of everything. And finally, I arrived at myself, and the very many times I have decided to stay in, watching reruns of Morse and Poirot, reading paperback novels in bed, whilst in the streets and bars and staged rooms of this city, miracles are miracling away, and I am only afterwards hearing about them on Facebook.
Yes. This is working? Yes. I'm the only one here, I think, who isn't a writer. But she assures me that that's not a defect. I think I'm in the category of people who help tell other people's stories. So I do that through my editing work. I work at Seagull Books. I've been there for almost 20 years now. And please tell me later that I don't look it. I edit, I work on a variety of manuscripts. We publish academic writing, creative nonfiction, a lot of fiction in translation from across India, across the world. And I also design all the book covers for all of the Seagull books, which for me is still quite incredible, because when I came to work at Seagull Books, I didn't actually know that I could design. I kind of muddled into it, propelled, I think, by the excitement of the words on the page. And I sort of almost couldn't help myself from transforming them into pictures. So that's what I do. And another thing that I do that Jayapriya mentioned is I translate from the Bengali into the English. Not as much as I would like to, because there isn't always enough time. But I do that as well. And that's something that I really enjoy doing, which is sort of rowing a story across, I think, from one shore to another, and then trying to see if it can sort of stand for itself on the other bank, having crossed over a river of language. So in a sense, I suppose I ferry stories about rather than write any of my own yet. So that's who I am.
I seem to have an A-list stellar panel on stage. Incredible writers, designers, translators. And I do have a question which will take us through the different forms of storytelling that this panel is about. So I'm going to start with you, Sunandini. Absolutely. So, my day job is that of a literary agent, and one of the things that happens when we sell books in different territories is that covers are always a point of conflict, of argument, of major discussion, and it doesn't get resolved. Most times, I have to tell the writer, it doesn't matter, let it go, you're going to be published in another country. But I'm fascinated by Sunandini's capacity to design covers that seem to work across regions. How do you do this? Really, how?
I think the starting point and the ending point for all book covers is the book. It's not the market.
I want to say many things, but I won't.
Yeah, no. I think at Seagull, before I started to design the covers, there was a tradition of Naveen doing all of the graphic design. He was also self-taught. And I inherited both the sort of pleasures and perils that come with being a self-taught designer. And one of the pleasures of being a self-taught designer is that you don't actually know the rules. So you make your own. That's one. The second thing that's contributed to perhaps the glory of the Seagull design ethic is the fact that at Seagull there is tremendous excitement about every book. And we don't approach the book from the point of view of, okay, so this is an academic book and it should get a boring cover or a simple cover. This is a 5-star author who's won the Nobel Prize, so he or she gets, an extra cover or an extra boost on the cover. And this is a sort of first-time poet who's not really going to be read that much. We believe in him or her, but it's okay. When I have a crop of books on the table, I have what I'm looking at as a crop of stories on the table. And if we don't believe in them at all, then we shouldn't be doing them. There's no caste system of either authorship or genre, for that matter. So I am foolish enough to attack them with the same degree of enthusiasm and gusto. And therefore, I put in as much work on a book that, say, for example, we've just done on medical clowning as I have on Mo Yan's novel When He Won the Nobel, right? That's one. The second thing is the absence of rules also opens up the entire universe of imagery and color when you are choosing which part of the story you want to interpret and how, right? So you don't say that because this is a book about China, it has to be read And, there has to be a certain
no
kind of
peacocks
flag.
on Indian
Yeah,
cover.
yeah. So like a book on India doesn't have to have peacocks. And so on, right? I think the first rule is that the cliches don't apply, because the book often at Seagull is at Seagull because it's not a cliche book. The second very, very important factor is at the point at which I'm designing the cover, I'm adopting and I am making my own the story of the book. I'm its author for that moment in time. And I make it my own, and I retell either all of it or a fragment of it on the cover. And in that sense, I become, and I'm very conscious, that I am giving the book its first voice, its first shout out in the universe. Because for the majority of authors, I think, out there, everyone is not known to everyone, and it's not possible if you just see the sheer volume of publishing. So I think the first chance that the book has is for that cover to just register, whether it's a thumbnail, whether it's across a bookstore. And if it doesn't either whisper to you or shout out to you or just make you blink twice, then it's lost that chance. And therefore, what aspect of it do you put out? How do you make it put its best foot forward? Yeah. So that there is just that second look and a chance that someone's going to pick it up, and then the next story begins, which is therefore the story. So I think that approach, and we've just, when we began the more international part of the Seagull books, which has all these foreign languages from which we are translating, we were actually incredibly naive. So we were not even aware that we should be doing a cover for the Americas and a cover for UK, which we've later heard is apparently like a big thing,
separate panel.
Because apparently the UK, there was a particular season when all the UK publishers and booksellers said, if a book is yellow, it's going to bomb. I have no idea why, but America was okay with yellow that year. And then the next year, it was, I think, a certain shade of green. And we are just, color is a color.
Like I said, Neeta, maybe separate panel next year on this.
You'll have to drag me away from it, but okay. So I think one of the examples I always give is, why do millions of people, many of them save and scrimp to visit some of the best known museums in the world, to look at some of these paintings? Why does no one say that, this year we won't go and look at the sunflowers because yellow's not in England, So I think the power of an image, if it is thoughtfully put together, if it arises and represents the content. I've done a book of French philosophy, and I've put the work of an Indian, very Bengali sculptor on the cover. Now, I didn't do that just to make a point, but I did it because it actually just completely coincided with the content, and it also brings up a question of which we are also very preoccupied with at Seagull, which is that a lot of human experience and thought is actually universal. So a French philosopher's thought can be very, very beautifully and very appropriately be represented by the work of a Bengali sculptor who's had the same thought, in a completely different time and place. But that is why we are writing also, because somewhere the stories are striking chords, with each other across languages. So I don't know if that completely answers your question or not.
Given me lots of things to think about, and I'm sure the audience as well. So Jan, like I said before, I was completely obsessed with your postcard project, and I looked at your bio. You've done plays as well, and then you've had a novel published before, and you've got a new novel coming out. Since I think microfiction is something that's here to stay, given the different media we read on. But perhaps since you already read from your postcard project, perhaps you'd like to talk about your new book, which isn't available, but I think everybody would love to hear about her new book.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of crossovers between the microfiction and the new book. I mean, one of the things that I loved doing when I was writing the postcard stories was almost focusing in on the things in my own neighbourhood and my community that you walk past every day and you just don't see. I teach a lot of school children, and their little imaginations are just, there's no limit on them. You ask a child to make something up and you get a crazy story about a lobster in high heels or a dinosaur that lives under their bed. Something happens to us when we get to the age that we all are here, and imagination doesn't come as natural to us. And for me, the postcard stories was, you know that feeling after you've been on holidays and you have to get back in the gym and everything hurts for the first few days? Your imagination is exactly the same thing. The first few days of this project, I could not see stories anywhere. After a couple of weeks, it was starting to come naturally, and by the time I finished the year, I remember posting the last postcard and feeling really sad because I kept seeing stories everywhere. A pair of crutches abandoned by the side of the road. Oh, did somebody just get healed miraculously? What's the story there? And so very naturally from that has come, my next novel is based in East Belfast, which is the kind of Protestant working class community that grew up around the shipyards in Belfast. And I had exercised kind of my writer's eye to be able to see stories everywhere. And it felt very natural then for me to begin writing about the community that I live in. And I don't know how much people know about Northern Irish politics here, but there are a lot of symbols around loyalist culture: orange men, bonfires, flags, marching. And I became fascinated in this. It was a culture I'd grown up with, but I had never taken the time to learn the stories behind. And also to see those as quite exaggerated symbols. I'm a magic realist. I say that in the same way that people confess to being an alcoholic. It's a terrible burden to bear. But to begin to look at those symbols of loyalist culture, the idea of a bonfire, which in Belfast is in a very urban environment with houses next door, and it can be 80 or 90 feet tall. That is such a magical, exaggerated symbol. It lent itself very well to writing in a magic realist voice. So my next novel, which comes out at the beginning of April, is exploring the kind of loyalist culture in East Belfast, but through a magic realist lens. And this is the neighbourhood that exists right outside my doorstep, so it comes very easily.
Thank you, Jan. So moving on to Paul, you have a mic. So I was telling Paul just when we met outside for tea that, you know, he writes short stories, and I love reading short stories. I've never met anyone who doesn't love reading them. But as an agent, it's really the most challenging genre to sell. And anybody I look at, do you read short stories? Do you love them? I had this whole discussion on Twitter with a publisher from Granta who said, recommend me short stories. I sent her 2 manuscripts that I love. I think they stand tall. I think they stand tall with any work of fiction. So what made you choose that? What made you choose the genre of writing short stories, and how hard is it to be a short story writer, to be seen as a short story writer? I know you have the plays, I know you have the novel, I know you've won like so many awards, but short story, yeah, I have them all here.
So many.
Yeah, I can read them out. Yeah, but what compels you to write short stories?
Just first to say, I've been reading The Fire Starters, which is Jan's new novel, on the plane on the way over, and it's absolutely brilliant. So you really need to look out for that when it's coming out in April, isn't it?
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
I'll give you the money later.
Okay, no problem. Anyone else just bung me a little fiver at there? Well, I don't know that I chose them, they chose me. So I think, and I know that sounds like that one of those really writery things to say, like, oh, the character came to me and told me things and I just write it down, sort of nonsense that I hear. I don't know, I work very hard but to write, but what happened was when I was writing comedy, and I was writing plays, and someone approached me and said, you know, would you try writing a short story? You know, and as I said, I hadn't written prose since I was at school, you know, and I was thinking, I don't even know, I've never had to describe anything, I just write dialogue. I mean, how do you describe something? I mean, I really had to go back and learn how to do that, and I think that when you're beginning to write prose, I think it's a really natural thing for a writer to look at short stories, because they don't have to sustain their imagination that they haven't worked out yet, in terms of gym working out, to sort of, or to kind of train it to last long periods of time. And there's that, I think the writer Mary Lavin describes a short story as an arrow in flight. It's really beautiful, I think, and it really is that you just have to sustain it just to get to that door, or just to get to that target there, and your mind can cope with that. And particularly when you're starting to write prose. I think it's also interesting when you write, I think a lot of modern short stories particularly are written in the first person. And again, I think to sustain that first person narrative, it's easier in a short story. And I think reviewers and other people would say often that, a first person narrative for a whole novel can be irritating. If you don't like the voice, you're just going to be, no, I'm not going to read that. And also it limits you in terms of what you can tell in terms of other people's opinions and other people's insights to what's going on. So I think when I started off, it was a very useful way for me to practice. Short stories are very malleable, you can do almost anything with them. You can try out an idea and see if it floats. And if it floats on those 10 pages, you think, okay, well, I think this has legs. I think this is something I can go and work on. And so I think a lot of new emerging writers use it as a platform. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of writers then leave it behind.
Right.
And then go on to novels, because that's where the money is, that's where the success is, and the fame, and that's what we all want. We want money and fame. That's why I'm in the business, okay? Now, but most people, there are practical considerations. There's that joke where someone goes into, a writer goes into the agent, like you, and they go, here's my short story collection, and the agent goes, oh my God, this is amazing. I've never read anything like this. Have you got a novel?
Yeah.
The first thing they say is, have you got a novel? I will come back when the novel's written, because the industry is, the common perception is that they don't sell, and therefore, what's the point of publishing them in collections, and so lots of people stop writing them practically because, you end up giving them away. And I think often a short story, a novel worth of thinking has gone into that short story.
Correct.
Really, what you want to convey, what you're leaving out of the story, what is not said in it, but all of it's there. Just like in a play, you can have a scene, a dialogue between two people just having dinner, but we both know by the end of it they're not going to be together, even though that has not been said in the scene. Short stories are brilliant for that, and I think it was a really good transition for me from theatre into short story, because they work on very similar principles. And but yeah, I love short stories, and I love the intensity that you can maintain. That's the other thing, and that's what I really work on when I'm writing something short, is maintaining this emotional intensity for that. Because in a novel, you have to have light and shade. You can't bring someone to this terribly dark place and then do it for 300 pages. We're just not able as human beings to do that, but you can do that in a short story, and I love that. I love going to that dark place and sort of...
And leave the reader there.
Leave them there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like a bullet. It's like a bullet, just hits them and they have to go away, and love it.
Thank you. So my last question, I don't even know if we'll have audience questions, but is to Cheran, and I'd like to leave it on a kind of personal note. So nobody mailed me back, by the way. My panelists were really badly behaved. Nobody mailed me back. So I had to do my own homework. So when I read up about Cheran, I noticed that one of his poems was converted into a dance performance by a very dear friend of mine. And that was like, so I said, so you have here the story being told through design, the story being told through microfiction, the story being told through short stories, and the story being told through dance. I was quite fascinated to bring that aspect of it, and I'd love to hear about how that happened, and we have about 3 minutes. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
In 3 minutes, I can only read a poem, but I'm not going to do it. So that particular, I mentioned right in the beginning, my poetry career began by writing a poem on the burning of the public library. And this particular poem called The Second Sunrise, it inspired one of the famous dancers, the Parva Singapore Theatre Group, whom I didn't know at the time, to create a dance program based on that poem for almost an hour about the burning of the library and the impact. So that is not the first example actually, because when I use poetry as a form of resistance, we need to speak from multiple locations. Way back in Jaffna, the poetry has been set to music and folk music, so that can travel widely. And the second thing is that the particular kind of poetry and the series of poems were made into street theater, because we did not have access to a formal professional proscenium theater. So the street theater was the perfect form of bringing the poetry towards a wider audience. Then in exile, I had access to proper theater performances. So we create a place, not in a typical sense of verse play, but it is a series. You select a series of poems based on one particular incident or one particular theme, and make the poems into a play, creating it. So this is a kind of particular different form of storytelling using my poetry. There have been about 3 or 4 plays created using my poetry on various themes that we could take all over the world, right? And the one final different way of storytelling is there have been a couple of arts exhibitions inspired by my poetry. For example, the Dhaka Arts Festival has an entire installation of paintings, sculpture based on one single line. That is, there was a bridge that in Sri Lanka, in Jaffna. That bridge has seen all kinds of killings and massacre. A large number of military vehicles, heavy vehicles have crossed the bridge. It stood. A lot of people have to leave as refugees on the bridge. It stood. But when I return after 20 years, my poem says, one single tear collapses the bridge. So that particular line inspired the entire different form of installation covering the entire 35 years history. So these are some of the different kind of techniques the poetry could come up with, or the poet could come up with. 3 minutes, okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we have time for a couple of... Huh? I thought we have 8 minutes. We have time for a couple of questions. Well, I was told I have 8 minutes left. Sorry, are there any questions? Oh, 8 minutes. Oh my God, I've been racing them through it now. I'm so sorry. I apologize. Oh my God. So, yeah, I was like suddenly super stressed looking at it. So, Paul, would you like to read? Would you? Yeah, I think it would be great to hear from some of their work.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Do I need a microphone?
Do you want I can hold it for you?
Because I'm from Northern Ireland and we have very big voices. We usually had to make ourselves heard over the bombs and the shooting, so we just got used to shouting.
Please, I think you can
I
stand
should hold
up.
it? Okay, all right.
Here, do you want me to hold it?
Sorry, it's okay. Okay. Hello, how you doing? So I'm going to read this it's, I think it's only a page long, and it was, the one thing I didn't mention earlier on is the other thing that short story can do is it can launch you into a novel, or maybe perhaps I didn't mention it like that, but I mean, this was a character that came out when I was experimenting, and then it formed part of the novel, but as I made the novel happier. Because, it's not fair to depress people for 300 odd pages, I think, and I think you need to be more hopeful, but this is a little story. It's written in the voice of a little boy. So, my Aunt Maggie's house smells. Her breath does too. Her biscuits are always soggy, and they're never chocolate. And that's because she's poor. She's poorer than Colin Mulvanna in my class at school, who only ever has sugar sandwiches for lunch every day. My Aunt Maggie always has bruises, and that's because she never does anything right. That's what my Uncle Malachi says. But my Uncle Malachi, he doesn't know anything. My Aunt Maggie is the best. She sings me songs and she dances with me too. And she holds my hands and we jig and dances and we run around going, yoo-hoo, and we laugh and we hold our stomachs and we fall under the settee. My Aunt Maggie is quiet and she's always busy moving ornaments and straightening pictures and wiping under cups when there's nothing there to wipe. She never sits her fat arse down getting on everybody's fucking nerves. That's what my Uncle Malachi says. But she doesn't when she's on her own with me. You only have to look at my Aunt Maggie to know that all she wants is to be happy and for everybody to be happy together. And I know this is true for definite. And not because she's told me, it's because I see it in every single wipe. And I know it with all the tingles on my arm because I want that too, but there's only us that does. Nobody else, so I hide it and so does she. But not when she's on her own with me. And I'm going to tell you a secret now. I've never told anyone this before. When we're on our own, my Aunt Maggie holds me in her arms. And she hugs me tight to her. And she doesn't let go. And I never want her to. I want her to stay there forever until I die, until we die together. And today, right, she said to me, Stephenson, I love you. And I'm not making it up. I didn't see it on the TV or anything. My Aunt Maggie loves me. She loves me. She does. And I know, because when she said those words to me, my heart hurt and my eyes stung. And I felt so sick. My stomach tried to leave me and go to her and stay with her forever because I can't. I wish my Aunt Maggie was my mummy. I wish I'd grown inside her tummy. And that I could remember being held by her all day long. I wish she'd leave Uncle Malachi and take me with her. We could run away together, and when I grow up, I can marry her. And it doesn't matter that she will be older than me, because she's older than me now, and it doesn't. I'll keep her safe, and I'll never hurt her. And she will give me hugs every day, and we will be happy forever and ever.
That was gorgeous. We have time for questions now. Sure.
Yeah. This question is addressed to Sunandini. And I know you told that only after reading a book you decide whether you will design a cover or not. But I want to have your prima facie answer. I've been shortlisted in the I Write program. I'm one of the 10 shortlisted, and my book proposal is about non-fiction. The title is Mass Fatalities Management After Disasters. That means how to manage dead bodies, which I have done research, how to recover, preserve, identify and dispose unidentified bodies. Will you be prima facie interested in designing the book if once I write and it is accepted by a publisher?
This is a trick question. Yes, I'll give you my email and you can write to me. And if I like the book, I'll do the cover.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My question is probably for Jayapriya, although Sunandini or Cheran are the other ones most affected by this. But you said you found that short fiction was probably the most challenging form to get published. Where's poetry then?
Pardon?
Poetry. Where's poetry?
Oh.
And what's happening with that or not happening with that?
Well, I as an agent, I find it that I don't read enough poetry to represent it anymore. I think that to represent poetry fairly, you have to be reading it all the time. So I don't do a poetry list as an agent. So I stick with the very broad fiction, non-fiction genres. No poetry and no children's books. So it's quite specific to fields.
I think almost everyone I've met and anyone who reads has affirmed the fact that some of their most moving experiences have been reading poetry. So the fact that we, the market, we, the readers, don't like poetry, I think is a huge myth. In the Indian context, I definitely see a more heartening trend, at least in poetry in translation, happening much more from the local languages, which I think also needs to be there. Our distribution in India is taken care of by Pan Macmillan. And a few days ago, when they came to visit us in Calcutta, they gave us the extraordinary good news that bookstores in India are asking to stock more poetry. So I think publishers need to go back to looking at more poetry. I think the worry that came in between was something from the cycle of selling coming back from the chain bookstores, because poetry needs more time on the shelf. And you have to, leave them there, people will discover them, come back to them, and so on. But I think it would be a mistake, and it is a mistake for a lot of publishers to say, no poetry. Because just like everyone loves short stories, I think it's the human connection to verse and rhythm of a certain kind is still fairly fundamental and thriving.
Actually, this morning, The Guardian published an article that poetry sales in the UK are on the rise. And they talked a little bit about how, in times of, the world's in a difficult place at the minute, and poetry is where people turn to. And we come from a place where we're in the minority. Like, you cannot throw a stone in Belfast and not hit a poet. Sometimes I'd quite like to throw stones at them. And one of the wonderful things in Northern Ireland is that poetry has been used powerfully as a tool of reconciliation and understanding each other's stories. So we have a strange setup where poetry still doesn't sell, but in terms of festivals and appearances and things, it's very poetry heavy, so the poets are very front and central in terms of their exposure. So maybe move to Belfast. Yeah.
So, I was just going to ask the three authors here if the fact that each of you come from an area where there's a lot of conflict, if there's a key element in that that has led you to your different forms of writing that you see as distinct from others. You've touched on that with the poetry, but and is that related to a kind of forced tangibility that others who may have been in less conflict areas are able to move past or not have drive themselves? It's kind of an open-ended question.
Shall I start, because I'm holding the microphone? It's a nice position to be in. I run the C.S. Lewis Festival at home. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books, is from Northern Ireland. And so most of us children in Northern Ireland cut our teeth reading Narnia, and we learn escapism as a way of dealing with what you're seeing around you. So for me, very much so, magic realism and fantasy and that ability to escape was a key thing. But I was saying to Paul last night, I always feel awful saying that my favourite writers are dead, white, American male writers. That's not a very cool thing to say when you're a feminist. But I also cut my teeth on real realism. So Carver and Steinbeck and Salinger, and it's the juxtaposition of the two things that I think is really important, that you can write analytically and with unswerving detail about the difficult stuff, but also offer your reader a bit about what Paul was talking about, this aspect of hope. And sometimes that's the fantastical element, that you lift people beyond their circumstances.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to tackle my experience in Northern Ireland, and I talk a lot about this when I'm teaching as well. I mean, writers, our gift is to be able to express certain ideas when we think about it a lot and work very hard, hopefully successfully, and that there are a lot of unheard voices. And in troubles in Northern Ireland, primarily affected working class people whose stories weren't really getting told. And so for me, it was really important to go to talk about as someone who'd experienced that as a working class person, to tell that story, you know. And for example, now we have the highest rates of teenage suicide in Europe, and we have there's so many problems that we have there that aren't discussed often enough, because there's the danger of the one story. You know, we are the troubled area. We're the area of the troubles. And if you have a story that isn't that, then you're not hitting, you know, the sweet spot for a publisher, you know. And so, you know, if these children are so flummoxed and so unable, tortured by the inability to say what's wrong with them, that they're taking their own lives, then whose job is it to try and put that into words? It's a writer's job, you know? So for me, it's those are the things when people say, what do you want to write about, or how do you try, those are the things that I find compelling, you know.
So my response, as a response to the questions, I would like to read a poem. I think that would settle the issue. The title of the poem is Ask, Ask. It was translated from Tamil by my friend Lakshmi Holmstrom, so I thank her. Ask snakes how to copulate. Ask the morning how to dawn. Ask the trees the meaning of patience. Ask slave workers what color dreams are. Ask the refugees how their tears became their prison cells. Ask women and blacks who must walk the streets of this town at night what fear is. Ask the lovers who wear no studs, where the last for only 30 days. Ask the monsoon, where the fish have all disappeared, fish which once sang in the still milky ocean beneath the bridge on full moon nights. And ask a lost diaspora what is born out of the loneliness of language. And ask her who flung a living ember of fire upon the ice cliffs of my life. And ask her about the quintessential loneliness of grief. And ask her, and ask her, and ask her, and finally, you ask me. When the last train of an evening has gone, and the railway line shiver and break in the cold, what it is to wait, what it is to wait with a single wing and a single flower. Thank you.